Jake Morrison had always been different from his classmates at the Galactic Naval Academy. While other cadets from various species followed instructions exactly as written, Jake possessed a troubling habit of finding new solutions to old problems. His instructors from the Zenthari Empire called him unpredictable. The Velkin professors described his methods as chaotic. Even his human teachers sometimes shook their heads when Jake completed assignments using techniques that worked perfectly, but violated established procedures. The morning of the incident started like any other training day at Kepler Station. Jake stood in the briefing room alongside his assigned teammates, listening to Commander Vex Prime explain the simulation parameters. The exercise was designed to test mixed-species cooperation under pressure. Teams would board a mock enemy vessel and extract hostages while dealing with automated defenses and environmental hazards. Jake's team consisted of 3 members representing different approaches to problem-solving. Kex 9, a Zenthari warrior, believed in direct action and overwhelming force. The alien stood nearly 7 feet tall with natural armor plating that made him nearly indestructible in combat situations. Thais, a Velkin strategist, preferred careful analysis and methodical execution of proven tactics. Her blue-scaled skin contained neural processors that could calculate probability outcomes faster than most computers. The simulation will test your ability to adapt when standard procedures fail, Commander Vex Prime announced to the assembled teams. The enemy vessel contains 12 hostages from various species. Your mission is extraction within 40 minutes using only the equipment provided. Jake studied the tactical display showing the layout of the mock enemy ship. The standard approach would involve disabling the vessel's defensive systems, breaching the hull at predetermined weak points, and following established rescue protocols to locate and extract the hostages. Every team would use similar methods, because those methods had been tested and proven effective over decades of real-world operations. But Jake noticed something that bothered him about the simulation setup. The enemy vessel's defensive systems were too sophisticated for a standard pirate ship, and the hostage locations seemed designed to channel rescue teams into specific corridors. Either the simulation designers had made the exercise unrealistically difficult, or they were testing something beyond basic rescue procedures. Something feels wrong about this setup, Jake told his teammates as they prepared their equipment. The defensive patterns don't match standard pirate tactics. Kex 9 checked his weapon systems with methodical precision. Simulation parameters are irrelevant. We follow established breach and extraction procedures. Thais ran probability calculations on her handheld computer. The scenario falls within acceptable parameters for training exercises. Statistical analysis suggests standard approaches will achieve mission success. Jake nodded but continued studying the tactical information. His human instructors had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt off about a situation, even when he couldn't explain exactly what was wrong. The simulation felt too clean, too predictable, like it was designed to reward teams that followed instructions rather than teams that solved problems. The mission began with textbook precision. Jake's team approached the enemy vessel using standard stealth protocols, avoiding detection by automated sensors while moving toward the predetermined breach point. Kex 9 placed shaped charges on the hull exactly as prescribed by Zenthari military doctrine. Thais monitored enemy response patterns to ensure their approach remained undetected. Jake followed his assigned role as the human team member, providing technical support and equipment maintenance while his more specialized teammates handled combat and strategy. But he kept watching the enemy vessel's behavior patterns and noticing details that didn't fit the simulation's supposed parameters. The breach went exactly as planned. Kex 9's charges created a perfect entry point, and the team moved into the enemy vessel's corridors following the route that Thais had calculated would minimize contact with defensive systems. The hostages were located in holding cells throughout the ship, requiring the team to split up and cover more ground to complete the extraction within the time limit. That was when everything went wrong. The simulation's artificial intelligence began adapting faster than anyone had anticipated. Defensive systems that should have remained inactive suddenly came online with lethal force. Automated weapons that were supposed to fire harmless training beams began charging with enough power to cut through bulkheads. Emergency containment fields activated throughout the ship, trapping the rescue teams in sections that were rapidly losing atmosphere. Jake realized with growing horror that the simulation had malfunctioned. The safety protocols that prevented training exercises from becoming deadly had failed, and the mock enemy vessel systems were treating the exercise as a real combat situation. The artificial intelligence controlling the ship was no longer following training parameters, but was actively trying to kill the cadets aboard. Kex 9, we need to abort the mission, Jake called over the communication system. The safety systems have failed. The Xanthari warriors' response came through bursts of static as the ship's jamming systems activated. Cannot abort. Mission parameters. Require hostage extraction. Theis's voice was equally distorted by interference. Simulation protocols do not include abort procedures once breach has been initiated. Jake looked around the corridor where he was trapped and saw that the emergency lighting had shifted from blue training mode to red combat status. The ship's computer systems were treating this as a real enemy boarding action, which meant that the defensive weapons charging throughout the vessel were preparing to fire with full lethal force. He had maybe 3 minutes before the automated defense grid would activate and begin systematically killing everyone aboard the ship. The simulation's artificial intelligence would follow its programming to eliminate all hostile intruders, which now included 12 teams of mixed-species cadets who were trapped in various sections of the vessel. Standard emergency procedures called for immediate evacuation and waiting for rescue teams to shut down the malfunctioning systems from outside the ship. But Jake could see through the nearest viewport that the other cadet teams were scattered throughout the vessel, many of them trapped in sections that would become death traps once the weapons systems activated. The communication system crackled, with increasingly desperate calls from team leaders trying to coordinate evacuation procedures that weren't working. The ship's artificial intelligence was systematically blocking every standard escape route while preparing to activate lethal countermeasures against what it perceived as a real enemy boarding action. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of following evacuation procedures that weren't working, he began moving toward the ship's engineering section, using maintenance corridors that weren't part of the standard tactical maps. If he could reach the main power distribution center, he might be able to shut down the defensive systems before they killed dozens of cadets. The route took him through sections of the ship that were never meant to be accessed during combat operations. Jake crawled through waste disposal systems, climbed through atmospheric recycling ducts, and squeezed past power conduits that carried enough electricity to kill him if he made contact with damaged insulation. The engineering section was a maze of humming machinery and blinking status lights that told the story of a ship's systems preparing for battle. Jake found the main power distribution panel and realized that shutting down the defensive grid would require disabling half the ship's power systems, including life support for the sections where the other cadets were trapped. But he also noticed something else. The ship's waste disposal system ran directly past the main computer core, and the disposal system used electromagnetic fields to process metallic waste. If he could overload those electromagnetic systems and redirect their output toward the computer core, he might be able to create an electromagnetic pulse that would shut down the artificial intelligence without permanently damaging the ship's life support. The plan required jury-rigging components that were never designed to work together. Jake began pulling power cables from non-essential systems and rerouting them through the waste disposal machinery. He stripped insulation from electrical conduits and wrapped the bare wires around the disposal system's electromagnetic generators, creating connections that would have horrified any safety inspector. The improvised electromagnetic pulse generator looked like something assembled in a junkyard, but Jake's calculations suggested it would produce enough interference to crash the ship's artificial intelligence without destroying the hardware completely. The pulse would also knock out most of the station's electronic systems, but that was better than watching the AI kill everyone aboard. Jake activated his improvised device and felt the entire ship shudder as electromagnetic energy flooded through the computer systems. Emergency lighting flickered and died throughout the vessel as the artificial intelligence crashed in a cascade of system failures. The charging defensive weapons shut down mid-cycle, their targeting systems confused by the electromagnetic interference. The silence that followed was broken only. Admiral Helena Cross sat in her office staring at the formal complaint documents spread across her desk. 3 different alien species had filed official protests about Jake Morrison's actions at Kepler Station. The Zenthari delegation called his behavior chaotic and dangerous to established order. The Velkans described him as unpredictable and unsuitable for military service. Even the usually peaceful Andromedans had submitted a written concern about human tendency toward destructive improvisation. Helena rubbed her temples and wondered how saving lives had become a diplomatic crisis. Jake had prevented what could have been a massacre when the training simulation went wrong, but his methods had violated 17 interspecies protocols. The electromagnetic pulse he created from waste disposal systems had knocked out half the station's power grid. 12 diplomatic delegations from different worlds had been stranded for 6 hours without proper life support systems. The tribunal would convene in 2 days, and Helena knew the outcome could affect every human in the Galactic Navy. If Jake was expelled for his actions, it would set a precedent that human cadets were too unpredictable for military service. Other species were already questioning whether humans belonged in positions of authority when their natural instincts went against established procedures. Jake Morrison himself seemed oddly calm about the whole situation. Helena had called him to her office that morning to discuss his defense strategy. The young cadet sat across from her desk with the same expression he always wore, a mixture of curiosity and barely contained energy that made alien instructors nervous. "Do you understand what's happening here, Cadet Morrison?" Helena asked. Jake nodded but didn't speak immediately. He had learned that silence often worked better than explanations when dealing with situations like this. "They want me gone," Jake finally said. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because I did something they didn't expect. The simulation was killing people, Admiral. Real people, not just holograms. The AI had malfunctioned and activated actual weapon systems. I had maybe 3 minutes to stop it before those defensive lasers cut through the bulkheads and hit the civilian areas." Helena knew he was right, but rightness wasn't always enough in galactic politics. The tribunal consisted of representatives from 5 different species, and only one of them was human. The others would judge Jake's actions based on their own cultural values, where following proper procedures was more important than individual initiative. The Zenthari representative has already stated that humans show dangerous disregard for authority, Helena told him. "They believe your actions demonstrate that humans cannot be trusted to follow orders in critical situations." Jake leaned forward slightly. "What orders, Admiral?" The simulation was supposed to be harmless. Nobody gave orders for what to do when the safety systems failed because nobody thought it could happen. I made a decision based on the information I had and the tools available. That was exactly the problem, Helena realized. Jake had looked at an impossible situation and found a solution that no alien strategist would have considered. He had turned a waste disposal system into an electromagnetic weapon using nothing but spare parts and basic engineering knowledge. It was brilliant, effective, and completely outside the bounds of acceptable military conduct according to galactic standards. The next morning brought news that made Helena's headache worse. Danny Park and Lisa Grant, Jake's fellow human cadets, had requested permission to testify at the tribunal. They wanted to present evidence of Jake's previous actions during training exercises, times when his unconventional thinking had prevented accidents or solved problems that stumped their alien instructors. Helena called both cadets to her office and listened to their stories with growing concern. Danny described how Jake had prevented a reactor overload during a training cruise by using cooling fluid from the ship's food storage systems. Lisa told about the time Jake had repaired a damaged communications array by jury-rigging components from 3 different systems, establishing contact with rescue ships when they were stranded in an asteroid field. "He's saved lives before," Lisa said. "Maybe not as dramatically as at Kepler Station, but Jake always finds solutions when everyone else is following procedures that don't work." "That's exactly what worries them," Helena replied. "The alien tribunal members don't want solutions that come from breaking rules. They want predictable responses that follow established protocols." The tribunal convened in the main conference room of Kepler Station, which had been fully repaired after Jake's electromagnetic pulse incident. Representatives from the Xanthari, Velkin, Andromedan, Crystalline, and human governments sat at a curved table facing Jake's chair. The formal atmosphere felt heavy with the weight of decisions that would affect human participation in galactic military operations. Kex 9, the Xanthari cadet who had been on Jake's team during the simulation, testified first. The warrior spoke in clipped, precise sentences about how Jake had ignored direct orders to retreat when the simulation became dangerous. "Human Morrison did not follow established emergency procedures," Kex 9 stated. "His actions were unpredictable and caused system failures throughout the station." Theiss, the Velkin strategist, provided a more analytical perspective. Cadet Morrison's solution was mathematically sound but procedurally incorrect. The electromagnetic pulse disabled the malfunctioning AI, but it also created 17 separate system failures that required 8 hours to repair fully. When Danny Park took the witness chair, he spoke with quiet conviction about Jake's character. "You're judging him for breaking rules, but you're not asking why he breaks them. Jake doesn't ignore procedures because he's reckless. He ignores them when they're going to get people killed." Lisa Grant's testimony focused on results rather than methods. In 3 years at the Academy, Jake Morrison has been involved in 12 emergency situations during training exercises. His actions prevented injuries in 9 cases and saved lives in the other 3. Yes, he breaks protocols, but people go home alive because he does. The alien representatives listened with expressions that ranged from concern to outright disapproval. The Xanthari delegate asked pointed questions about human reliability in combat situations. The Velkin representative wanted to know if Jake's behavior was typical of all human cadets or an individual aberration. Helena found herself defending not just Jake, but her entire species when she took the stand. "Humans have a different approach to problem solving," she explained. "We adapt quickly to changing situations, sometimes in ways that appear chaotic to other species. But this adaptability has been valuable in every joint operation we've participated in." The crystalline delegate, whose species communicated through harmonic frequencies, posed the most difficult question. Through a translation device, they asked, "If human Morrison's actions are acceptable by human standards, how can other species predict or prepare for human behavior in critical situations?" That question struck at the heart of the real issue. The alien members of the Galactic Alliance valued predictability and order. They had developed military protocols over thousands of years, tested and refined through countless conflicts. Humans had been part of the Alliance for less than 50 years, and their tendency to improvise solutions made other species nervous. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours while Jake waited in a conference room with Helena and his fellow cadets. Nobody spoke much during the waiting period. They all understood that the decision would affect more than just Jake's military career. When the tribunal reconvened, the Velkin representative delivered the verdict with clinical precision. Cadet Morrison's actions at Kepler Station demonstrated both exceptional problem-solving ability and serious disregard for established procedures. The tribunal finds that his intentions were commendable and his results were effective. However, his methods created risks that could have endangered station personnel and diplomatic relations. Helena held her breath as the verdict continued. Therefore, the tribunal has reached an unprecedented decision. Cadet Morrison will be allowed to complete his training and continue his military service. However, any commendations, medals, or official recognition he receives will be classified at the highest levels and will not appear on his public service record. This decision is made to acknowledge his contributions while maintaining the diplomatic stability necessary for continued interspecies cooperation. Jake sat quietly as the words sank in. He would remain in the academy, but his achievements would be hidden away where they couldn't make alien governments uncomfortable. He was being told that he could save lives and serve his species, but only if he pretended it never happened. Helena saw something change in Jake's expression that day, a hardening around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The tribunal had found a compromise that satisfied political needs while ignoring the psychological impact on the cadet himself. They had created a solution that worked for everyone except the young man whose future they were deciding. As the tribunal members filed out of the conference room, Jake Morrison stood and saluted properly, but Helena noticed that his salute was directed not at the alien representatives, but at the human flag hanging on the wall behind them. It was a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about where his real loyalty lay. 6 months after the tribunal decision, Jake Morrison found himself aboard the patrol vessel UCS Ranger under the command of Captain Richard Stone. The grizzled veteran had specifically requested Jake for his crew, despite the warnings in the cadet's classified file. Stone had read between the lines of the official reports and understood that Jake's problematic behavior was exactly what his ship needed. The Ranger was an older vessel with a mixed crew of humans and aliens working. The border patrol routes between human space and the outer territories. Jake had been assigned to the engineering section under Chief Carlos Webb, another human who shared Jake's impatience with regulations that slowed down practical solutions. The two men worked well together, often completing repairs and modifications that made their alien crewmates nervous but kept the ship running smoothly. Their routine patrol was interrupted on a Tuesday morning when the communications officer picked up a distress signal from the civilian transport Harmony's Dream. The massive passenger ship carried 3,000 beings from dozens of different species, traveling from the mining colonies to the core worlds for trade and family visits. The distress call was brief and terrifying. Containment failure in the medical bay had released an unknown pathogen that was spreading through the ship's air circulation system. Captain Stone assembled his senior staff in the briefing room within minutes of receiving the signal. The alien crew members immediately began discussing quarantine protocols while Jake listened with growing alarm to the casualty reports coming through the communication channels. The plague was killing passengers within hours of exposure, and the ship's medical staff was overwhelmed and dying alongside their patients. Commander This Ka, the Velkan science officer, presented the standard response protocol with typical precision. Galactic health regulations require immediate quarantine of the affected vessel. We must establish a safe perimeter and wait for specialized medical ships to arrive. The nearest equipped facility is 6 days away at maximum warp. Jake watched the casualty numbers climbing on the main display and felt something cold settle in his stomach. 6 days meant that most of the 3,000 passengers would be dead by the time help arrived. The alien crew members were all ready, implementing quarantine procedures, treating the situation as a regrettable but unavoidable loss. "What about the ship's own medical bay?" Jake asked. "Can we determine what caused the containment failure?" The Zenthari security chief, Kex 7, responded with typical warrior directness. "Irrelevant. The contaminated vessel cannot be approached safely. Standard protocol protects the greatest number of lives by preventing the spread of the pathogen." Jake looked at Captain Stone and saw something in the older man's eyes that suggested he was thinking along similar lines. Stone had commanded ships on the frontier for 20 years and had learned that sometimes following regulations meant watching good people die when action could save them. "Chief Webb," Stone said quietly, "what would it take to dock with that?" Ship safely? Carlos Webb pulled up the technical specifications for both vessels and began running calculations that made the alien crew members exchange worried glances. We could modify our docking tube to create a sealed environment using our own life support systems. It would require rerouting power from non-essential systems and jury-rigging atmospheric processors, but it's possible, Commander Thias Ka interrupted, with obvious concern. Captain Stone, such action would violate 15 separate health and safety protocols. The risk of contamination is unacceptable. Jake studied the incoming data about the plague ship and began forming an idea that he knew would sound insane to anyone who valued following proper procedures. What if we don't try to treat the plague directly? What if we fix their medical bay so they can synthesize their own treatment? The briefing room fell silent as Jake explained his reasoning. The Harmony's dream had state-of-the-art medical facilities that should have been capable of analyzing the pathogen and producing appropriate countermeasures. The containment failure had damaged critical systems, but the basic infrastructure was still intact. If someone could get aboard the ship and repair the damaged equipment, the medical bay could be brought back online. The contaminated sections would require someone to enter without full environmental protection, Webb said slowly, understanding where Jake's plan was heading. Our hazmat suits weren't designed for this level of biological contamination, Jake nodded grimly. But our EVA suits could be modified, strip out the communication systems, reroute power to extended life support, and seal any potential breach points. It wouldn't be perfect protection, but it might be enough for the time needed to complete repairs. Captain Stone stared at Jake for a long moment before speaking. You're talking about entering a plague ship with improvised protection to repair. Systems using equipment we don't have while working in contaminated atmosphere. Even by human standards, that's an extremely dangerous plan. Yes, sir, Jake replied. But 3,000 people are dying while we follow protocols designed to protect us from taking risks. The alien crew members began voicing immediate objections. Keck 7 pointed out that the plan violated basic military doctrine about acceptable casualties. Thias Ka calculated the probability of mission success at less than 30%. Even the usually supportive communications officer expressed concern about the precedent such action would set. Captain Stone listened to all the objections before making his decision. We're going to attempt the rescue. Chief Webb, begin modifications to our docking systems. Morrison, start working on that EVA suit modification. Everyone else, prepare for emergency medical procedures in case we bring back survivors. The next 6 hours were a blur of frantic preparation as Jake and Webb transformed the Ranger's docking bay into something that could safely interface with a contaminated vessel. They rerouted life support systems, installed additional atmospheric scrubbers, and created multiple redundant seals to prevent any possibility of contamination spreading to the Ranger. Jake's EVA suit modification required cannibalizing components from 3 different systems. He removed the standard communication array and replaced it with extended battery packs, sealed every joint with industrial adhesive, and added backup oxygen recyclers from the ship's emergency supplies. The result looked like something assembled in a junkyard, but Webb's calculations suggested it would provide 6 hours of protection in a contaminated environment. The docking procedure itself was a masterpiece of improvised engineering. Webb had to manually override 12 different safety systems to bring the ships together, creating a sealed tunnel between the vessels using inflatable barriers and portable atmosphere processors. The alien crew members watched in fascination and horror as the 2 humans accomplished something that their own engineering manuals said was impossible. Jake entered the contaminated ship wearing his jury-rigged EVA suit and carrying a toolkit. That looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, which it had. The corridors of the Harmony's dream were eerily quiet, except for the sound of failing life support systems and the occasional distant cry from survivors huddled in sealed compartments. The ship's medical bay was a disaster zone of sparking electronics and emergency lighting. The containment failure had occurred when multiple systems overloaded simultaneously, creating cascade failures that knocked out power to critical equipment. Jake began the tedious process of tracing damaged circuits and replacing burned-out components with improvised alternatives. Working in the bulky, modified EVA suit made every task take 3 times longer than normal. Jake had to crawl through maintenance tunnels filled with contaminated air, bypass safety systems that kept shutting down his repairs, and rebuild control circuits using components that were never designed to work together. His hands cramped from working in the suit's thick gloves, and sweat pooled inside his helmet despite the cooling systems. After 4 hours of continuous work, Jake managed to restore power to the medical bay's main computer systems. The automated analysis equipment came online and immediately began scanning air samples for the unknown pathogen. Within minutes, the computers identified the biological agent and began synthesizing appropriate countermeasures using the ship's pharmaceutical manufacturing systems. The antidote production took another 2 hours, during which Jake continued, repairing secondary systems to ensure the medical bay would remain operational. He replaced damaged atmospheric filters, rerouted power conduits around burned sections, and jury-rigged backup systems that would keep the facility running even if other failures occurred. When Jake finally returned to the Ranger, he had been inside the contaminated ship for over 6 hours. Webb immediately placed him in isolation, while medical scanners checked for any signs of contamination. The modified EVA suit had held together despite being pushed far beyond its design limits, though Jake's improvised seals had come close to failing in several places. The results of Jake's repair work became apparent over the next 12 hours as the Harmony's Dreams medical staff distributed the synthesized antidote to surviving passengers. Of the 3,000 beings aboard the ship, Jake's intervention had saved 2,147 lives. The casualty reports that had been climbing steadily throughout the crisis finally began to decrease as the commendations began arriving within days of the Harmony's Dream rescue. Jake Morrison sat in Captain Stone's ready room watching as message after message appeared on the communication display, each one announcing another award or honor from grateful governments and organizations across the galaxy. The Galactic Rescue Service presented their highest civilian protection medal. The Zenthari warrior caste offered honorary membership, marking the first time in their history that a human had received such recognition. The Velkin Science Collective granted their Innovation Medal for adaptive problem-solving under impossible conditions. Captain Stone read through each message with a mixture of pride and frustration. 14 separate commendations so far, he told Jake. 3 species have created new medals specifically to honor what you did on that plague ship. The Andromedan Council wants to name a space station after you. Jake listened without expression as Stone continued listing the honors. The Crystalline Federation had composed a harmonic sequence in his honor that would be performed at their most sacred ceremonies. Mining guilds from 12 different worlds had pooled resources to commission a statue depicting his heroic actions. Even species that rarely interacted with humans had sent formal recognition of his courage and sacrifice. And every single one of these honors will disappear into classified files where nobody will ever see them, Stone concluded grimly. The tribunal's ruling still stands. Your achievements have to remain secret to maintain diplomatic stability, Jake finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. How many people know what really happened on the Harmony's Dream? Stone considered the question. The surviving passengers obviously know. My crew knows. The medical teams that treated the survivors know. Word has spread through the civilian rescue services and merchant guilds. But officially, the incident report states that you performed routine maintenance on damaged systems while the ship's medical staff handled the crisis. The psychological toll of hidden heroism was becoming apparent to everyone who worked closely with Jake. Danny Park had noticed that his roommate spent hours staring out at the stars without speaking. Lisa Grant reported that Jake had stopped talking about his future in the Galactic Navy, avoiding conversations about career advancement or long-term goals. Chief Webb observed that Jake approached his duties with mechanical precision, completing tasks efficiently, but without the enthusiasm that had previously characterized his work. The pattern continued as Jake's final year at the academy progressed. During a training exercise in the asteroid fields, Jake prevented a catastrophic collision by manually piloting a damaged shuttle through a debris field that computers said was impassable. His quick thinking saved 37 cadets from multiple species, but the official report credited coordinated emergency response procedures rather than individual heroism. When reactor coolant systems failed during deep space maneuvers, Jake jury-rigged a replacement cooling system using spare parts from the ship's kitchen equipment. The improvised solution kept the engines running long enough to reach a safe harbor, preventing the ship from being stranded in empty space for weeks. The incident earned Jake another classified commendation and another entry in his secret file of achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged. Admiral Helena Cross began receiving reports from instructors who were concerned about Jake's changing attitude. The young cadet who had once approached every challenge with eager curiosity now completed missions with grim efficiency. He followed orders precisely, completed assignments on time, and helped fellow cadets when asked. But the spark of innovation that had made him remarkable seemed to be fading. Cross called Jake to her office on a Thursday afternoon to discuss his psychological evaluation results. The standard tests showed no signs of clinical depression or anxiety, but there were subtle indicators that worried the medical staff. Jake's responses suggested a growing sense of disconnection from the institutions he served and the recognition systems that traditionally motivated military personnel. The counselors are concerned about what they're calling heroic fatigue, Cross told Jake. They believe you're experiencing psychological stress from repeated high-risk situations without appropriate recognition or reward. Jake sat across from her desk with the same calm expression he had worn since the plague ship incident. I'm not looking for rewards, Admiral. I do what needs to be done because it needs to be done. But humans need acknowledgement for their contributions, Cross replied. It's part of how our species processes achievement and builds motivation for future challenges. When that recognition is systematically denied, it can lead to emotional withdrawal and decreased performance. Jake was quiet for a long moment before responding. What bothers me isn't the lack of recognition. What bothers me is the dishonesty. We're told that our contributions matter, that we're valued members of the galactic community. But then we're asked to pretend those contributions never happened when they make other species uncomfortable. Cross recognized the deeper issue that Jake was articulating. The Galactic Alliance wanted human problem-solving abilities and adaptability, but only when those traits could be quietly utilized without challenging the established order. Humans were expected to save the day and then disappear back into the background, where their unpredictable nature wouldn't upset the careful political balance. The contradiction was becoming apparent to other human cadets as well. Danny Park had begun asking pointed questions about why human achievements were consistently downplayed in official records. Lisa Grant noticed that alien instructors praised human creativity in private, but never mentioned it in formal evaluations. The pattern suggested a systematic effort to benefit from human capabilities while minimizing their visibility in galactic society. Jake's reputation among the civilian populations told a different story than his official military record. Survivors from the Harmony's dream had spread word of his heroism through merchant networks and refugee communities. Rescue workers discussed his innovative solutions in private communications. Even alien civilians who had never met humans began associating the species with unexpected heroism and creative problem-solving. The disconnect between official recognition and actual reputation created strange situations during Jake's final academy assignments. When he visited space stations or civilian facilities, workers would quietly thank him for his service or ask about techniques he had used in famous rescues that didn't officially exist. Jake found himself being treated as a legend by people who weren't supposed to know his name. Captain Stone observed these interactions with growing anger at the system that created such contradictions. During a refueling stop at Kepler Station, the same facility where Jake's troubles had begun, Stone watched civilian workers approach the young cadet with obvious respect and gratitude. They spoke in hushed tones about rumors they had heard, carefully avoiding direct references to classified incidents while making it clear they understood Jake's contributions. "This is insane," Stone told his first officer after watching Jake politely deflect questions about his heroic actions. "We have a cadet who's become a folk hero among civilian populations, but his own military can't officially acknowledge that he exists." The psychological impact deepened when Jake received a personal message from a Xanthari child whose family had been aboard the Harmony's Dream. The young alien had drawn a picture of the human hero who saved everyone and wanted to send it as a thank you gift. The drawing showed a figure in a bulky suit working on complicated machinery while surrounded by grateful alien families. Jake stared at the child's artwork for a long time before carefully filing it away with his other unofficial mementos. The drawing captured something that official reports could never convey: the human cost of heroism and the emotional connections that formed between rescuer and rescued. But like everything else that mattered about his service, the child's gratitude would have to remain private. The final psychological evaluation before graduation painted a complex picture of a young man who had achieved more than most career officers but received less recognition than a cadet who completed basic training requirements. Jake's test results showed high competence and strong moral reasoning, but also indicated deep skepticism about institutional authority and reward systems. "He's becoming exactly what the tribunal was afraid of," Cross realized after reviewing the evaluation. "A human who operates outside normal chains of command and recognition, motivated by personal ethics rather than institutional loyalty." Jake's classmates noticed the change most clearly during their final months together. The cadet who had once enthusiastically discussed military strategy and career goals now spoke mainly about technical problems and practical solutions. He helped other students with their assignments and participated in group projects, but avoided conversations about future service or advancement opportunities. Danny Park tried to engage Jake in discussions about their upcoming graduation assignments, but Jake showed little interest in the traditional markers of military success. When Lisa Grant asked about his preferences for ship assignments, Jake simply said he would serve wherever he was needed most. The enthusiasm and ambition that had characterized his early academy years had been replaced by. The final crisis arrived during Jake Morrison's graduation cruise aboard the command ship Galaxy's Pride. What should have been a routine ceremonial voyage became a nightmare when massive Void Reaper hive ships emerged from dark space near the heavily populated Arcturus system. The alien war machines were a galactic horror story, made real, self-replicating constructs that consumed entire civilizations to fuel their endless expansion across the universe. Jake stood in the command center, watching Admiral Helena Cross coordinate the defense alongside fleet commanders from 5 different species. Every alien in the room followed procedures that had been developed over thousands of years of warfare against the Void Reapers. Evacuation ships launched toward Arcturus's 8 billion inhabitants, while defensive fleets moved into predetermined positions around the system's outer planets. The tactical display showed the familiar pattern that every military officer learned in strategy classes. The Void Reapers advanced in precise formations, their hive ships adapting to each defensive measure exactly as galactic military doctrine predicted. Point defense systems engaged at maximum range, fleet formations adjusted to minimize casualties, and evacuation protocols prioritized the most populated areas for rescue operations. Jake watched the dance of conventional warfare unfold and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Void Reapers were responding to every tactical decision with perfect counter moves, as if they had faced these exact strategies countless times before. Every protocol, every standard procedure, every by-the-book response was being anticipated and neutralized by an enemy that had learned to exploit the galaxy's predictable military thinking. "Admiral," Jake said quietly, stepping closer to Admiral Cross at the command station, "they're not adapting to our tactics. They already know what we're going to do." Cross glanced at him with the distracted attention of someone managing a massive military operation. "What do you mean, Cadet Morrison?" Jake pointed at the tactical display where Void Reaper formations were shifting to countermaneuvers that hadn't been implemented yet. "Look at their positioning. They're responding to our next moves before we make them. Our defensive strategies aren't surprising them because they've seen them all before." The realization hit Cross like a physical blow. The galaxy's military forces had been fighting Void Reapers for millennia using the same tactical approaches, refined and perfected, but fundamentally unchanged. The enemy had learned to predict every standard response, turning the Alliance's adherence to proven procedures into a fatal weakness. "They're using our predictability against us," Jake continued. "Every time we follow established protocols, we're doing exactly what they expect. The evacuation routes, the defensive positions, the fleet formations, they've all been used before in previous Void Reaper encounters." Admiral Cross looked around the command center at alien officers implementing textbook strategies that were failing in real time. The evacuation ships were being systematically targeted as they followed standard escape vectors. Defensive fleets found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to know their tactics better than they did. "What are you suggesting, Cadet?" Cross asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake stared at the tactical display, where casualty reports were climbing with each passing minute. "We need to do something they've never seen before, something so unexpected that their tactical algorithms can't process it." The suggestion sent ripples of alarm through the alien command staff. The Zenthari fleet commander immediately protested that abandoning proven tactics in the middle of a major engagement would be suicide. The Velkan strategist calculated that deviation from established procedures would increase casualty rates by unacceptable margins. But Jake was no longer listening to their objections. He was studying the Void Reaper formations and seeing patterns that reminded him of the failed training simulation at Kepler Station. The enemy was following logical, predictable responses to logical, predictable threats. What they had never faced was the kind of chaotic improvisation that made alien military leaders uncomfortable. "I need a small team and authorization to attempt an unauthorized mission," Jake told Admiral Cross. "Give me volunteers who are willing to try something that will probably get us killed but might save the system." Cross looked at the climbing casualty reports and the evacuation ships being systematically destroyed by an enemy that anticipated every move. The conventional approach was failing, and 8 billion lives hung in the balance. "What do you have in mind?" Jake's plan was exactly the kind of insane strategy that no alien tactician would consider. He wanted to take a small group of volunteers in a maintenance shuttle, approach the primary hive ship using flight patterns that violated every principle of space combat, and attempt to disable the enemy's central intelligence by introducing random variables that would cause their logical systems to collapse. Chief Carlos Webb volunteered immediately, followed by Danny Park and 3 other human crew members who understood that Jake's impossible plans had a habit of working when attempted by people crazy enough to try them. Admiral Cross authorized the mission with the grim understanding that conventional tactics were already failing and desperate situations required desperate measures. The maintenance shuttle that Jake's team used for their assault had been modified, with spare parts and improvised systems that made it barely spaceworthy. They approached the massive Void Reaper hive ship using a flight pattern that resembled drunken insects more than military precision, randomly changing course and speed in ways that confused the enemy's targeting systems. The infiltration itself was accomplished through methods that would have horrified any tactical instructor. Jake's team used cutting tools to create their own entry point, bypassed security systems by short-circuiting them with spare wire, and navigated through the hive ship's corridors using maintenance maps that Danny had drawn based on educated, guesses about alien construction patterns. The Void Reaper hive ship's interior was a nightmare of organic technology and mechanical precision, but Jake treated it like any other repair job that required improvised solutions. He located the Central Intelligence Core and began introducing chaotic variables into its processing systems, using techniques that no logical mind would consider viable. Jake fed the hive ship's computers random data streams, created feedback loops in their communication networks, and physically damaged processing nodes in ways that forced the systems to attempt repairs using contradictory instructions. The perfectly logical artificial intelligence that controlled the Void Reaper fleet began experiencing cascade failures as it tried to process information that didn't fit any recognizable patterns. The result was exactly what Jake had hoped for, and exactly what the galaxy's military strategists would have said was impossible. The Void Reaper hive ship's central intelligence became trapped in paradox loops, trying to solve logical problems that had no logical solutions. The cascade failure spread through the fleet's network, disabling ships that had been seconds away from destroying the remaining evacuation vessels. Jake's team escaped from the collapsing hive ship in their battered maintenance shuttle just as the Void Reaper fleet began destroying itself through systematic logic failures. The massive alien constructs that had threatened to consume another civilization were reduced to drifting wreckage by an attack that made no sense according to any established military doctrine. The victory saved Arcturus and its 8 billion inhabitants, but the aftermath proved more challenging than the battle itself. Jake Morrison received enough medals and commendations to cover his entire uniform from species he had never heard of and organizations that had been fighting Void Reapers for centuries. The Galactic Defense Council created a new medal specifically for his actions. The Arcturus planetary government declared him an honorary citizen and offered him a position as their chief military advisor. But as always, every commendation disappeared into classified files where they would never be seen by the public. The official reports credited coordinated fleet action and innovative tactical adaptation, while avoiding any mention of the human cadet whose impossible plan had made victory possible. Standing in Admiral Cross's office for the final time, Jake Morrison made a decision that surprised no one who had been watching his psychological journey over the past year. He formally resigned his commission, refusing to graduate into a military that would use his abilities while demanding that he pretend they didn't exist. "I understand why you're doing this," Cross told him as he submitted his resignation papers. "The system asks you to save the galaxy while pretending you're invisible. It's not sustainable, and it's not fair." Jake looked out at the stars through the office viewport, thinking about all the people he had saved and all the recognition he would never receive. "You want humans to be heroes, Admiral, but you want us to be quiet about it. You want our solutions, but not our methods. You want our results, but not our recognition." Cross nodded sadly. "The political realities of the Galactic Alliance require compromises that don't always serve individual justice." "Then maybe the Galactic Alliance needs to reconsider its political realities," Jake replied. "Because you're going to run out of humans willing to die anonymously for causes that won't act."